The black maid took care of the Mafia boss's father every day, until he discovered the real reason. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It all started on a quiet afternoon in one of the most luxurious mansions in the city. The walls of the sprawling estate, adorned with expensive artwork and chandeliers, echoed with the sounds of everyday life. But for Jasmine, the black maid who had worked there for years, it was a world far removed from the opulence that surrounded her. Each morning, she would wake up early, prepare breakfast for the family, and take care of the elderly Mafia boss's father. She had been doing this for as long as she could remember, with patience and dedication. The old man, a frail and sickly figure, had been in her care for nearly 2 years. His health had steadily declined, and he could barely move without assistance. But Jasmine never complained. Her job was simple: make sure he was comfortable, keep him company, and make him feel cared for. To the world outside, Jasmine was just another servant, a woman whose job was to serve the rich, with little to no regard for her humanity. She knew the rules: stay invisible, never speak unless spoken to, and always smile, even when her heart was breaking. But there was one thing she did that no one ever knew about. She didn't just take care of him. She listened. She learned about his past, his regrets, his joys, and his fears. She had heard stories about his son, the feared Mafia boss, and the legacy he had built. She knew the man's reputation, but she never judged him. She simply focused on caring for his father, who was a shadow of the powerful man he once was. Every day, as Jasmine sat by the elderly man's side, she would hum softly to calm him, speaking to him in a way that no one else did. She had a gift for soothing him, for easing his pain, and for making him feel less alone in a world that had long forgotten him. But one day, everything changed. It was a normal morning, with sunlight streaming through the large windows of the mansion. Jasmine was preparing the old man's breakfast when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. She looked up to see the Mafia boss, his son, standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, as always, and his cold eyes seemed to pierce through her. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and commanding. Jasmine froze. She had never spoken to him directly before, always keeping her distance. But something about the way he looked at her made her feel as though he was seeing right through her. "I was just helping him," she said quietly, her heart racing. The Mafia boss stepped into the room, his gaze still fixed on her. He looked at his father, then back at Jasmine. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a slight nod, he spoke again. "You've been taking care of him every day, haven't you?" Jasmine nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. The boss's expression softened for a split second, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you cared for him like this." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. He had never acknowledged her presence before, and now, out of nowhere, he was speaking to her like she mattered. But there was something in his tone, something that told her this wasn't just about his father. It was about her. The tension in the room was palpable, but Jasmine refused to break eye contact. She had spent so many years invisible, but in that moment, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she thought. Then, the Mafia boss did something that Jasmine would never forget. He walked over to his father's side and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "You've done more for him than I ever could." Jasmine was stunned. The man who had built an empire with fear and ruthlessness was thanking her, a maid, a woman who had always been treated as nothing more than a servant. But as she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected, a flicker of gratitude, a glimpse of humanity. It was then that Jasmine realized the real reason she had been taking care of the old man. It wasn't just a job. It was a calling, a way for her to bring light into the darkness that surrounded her. She had no idea how much her kindness had meant to the Mafia boss, but in that moment, it felt like the weight of the world had shifted just a little bit. What would happen next would change everything for both of them. Stay tuned for what comes next. As the days passed after their unexpected conversation, Jasmine could not shake the feeling that something had changed. The Mafia boss, once a figure of cold authority, now seemed different, almost human. He hadn't spoken to her like that before, not like she mattered. But there was no denying the shift in the air, a kind of respect she had never imagined from someone like him. Yet, despite the shift in their dynamic, Jasmine found herself unsure of what would come next. Would he keep his word? Would he acknowledge her work as something more than just a maid's duty? The next few days were filled with the usual routines, but Jasmine couldn't ignore the growing sense of curiosity that lingered in her mind. The elderly man's health continued to decline, but Jasmine remained dedicated, providing him with the comfort and care he needed. She had never expected any recognition, never thought she would receive anything but a silent acknowledgement of her work. But now, with every glance from the Mafia boss, it felt like something deeper was stirring, something unspoken, yet heavy in the air. One evening, as she was finishing her duties, Jasmine found herself in the garden outside the mansion, taking a brief moment to gather her thoughts. The garden was one of the few places where she could escape the tension of the mansion, a place where she could breathe freely, away from the eyes of the family and the staff. As she stood by the flower bed, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps. Turning around, she found herself face to face with the Mafia boss once again. He had been watching her from the shadows, his eyes sharp and calculating. But this time, there was something different in his gaze. "You've been taking care of him so well," he said, his voice quieter than usual, softer. Jasmine was taken aback by the unexpected praise. She had always kept her head down, never expecting much, but now, hearing the boss speak like this, she felt a small surge of pride. "He's my responsibility," Jasmine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't know what else to say. "I don't know if you realize this, but he doesn't have much time left," he continued, his gaze shifting to the old man's window where he could be seen resting inside. Jasmine's heart clenched. She had known that his health was deteriorating, but hearing it from the Mafia boss felt like a harsh reminder of the fragility of life. "I know," she said softly, "but I will continue to do everything I can for him." The boss studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes piercing into hers. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. "I've been watching you, Jasmine," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something more, something almost vulnerable. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected the Mafia boss to admit he had been paying attention to her, let alone her dedication to his father. "Why do you do it?" he asked, his tone almost inquisitive. "Why do you care for him so much when no one else does?" Jasmine swallowed hard, her heart racing. She had never really questioned why she cared so much for the elderly man. It wasn't something she had thought about before. "Because he's still a person," she said quietly. "And he deserves dignity, even in his last days. No one should be forgotten, not even him." The Mafia boss nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Jasmine wondered if he was going to say something else, something more, but instead, he remained silent, lost in his thoughts. Then, without a word, he turned and began to walk away, his footsteps echoing in the garden. Jasmine watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions. It was as if a door had opened between them, but it was unclear where it would lead. The next morning, as Jasmine was assisting, the elderly man, the Mafia boss, appeared at the doorway, his presence commanding as always. He didn't speak at first, but simply stood there, watching her with that same intensity she had grown accustomed to. "Jasmine," he finally said, breaking the silence. "I've been thinking." She turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster. "About what?" "About you," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. Jasmine's breath hitched. She didn't know what to say. "You've shown me something I didn't expect," he continued, stepping further into the room. "And for that, I owe you something." Jasmine looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I can't promise you much," he said, his voice softer now. "But I can promise you this. You will be taken care of. Your hard work and dedication won't go unnoticed." Jasmine blinked, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this, not from him. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure of what to make of his words. The Mafia boss gave her a nod, a rare moment of acknowledgement. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a slight smirk. "The real reason you've been taking care of him is about to be revealed. And when it is, everything will change. Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what he meant, but somehow, she could sense that the moment she had been waiting for was drawing near. Everything she had done, all the care she had given, was about to come to light, and it would change not only her life, but the life of the Mafia Boss as well. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Jasmine. The Mafia Boss had given her a promise that was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. She had never expected to hear words like that from someone who had always been so distant, so impervious to the lives of those around him. Yet here he was, acknowledging her efforts, recognizing her dedication to his father. The change was subtle at first, but it was enough to stir something deep within her. She had been a part of this world for so long, moving in the shadows, always careful, always invisible. But now, for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had a place in it. As she continued to care for the elderly man, Jasmine couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere around her. The other staff members, who had once ignored her, now seemed to regard her with a different kind of respect. They didn't speak to her directly, but there was a subtle change in the way they looked at her, as if they, too, had sensed the shift in the power dynamics of the house. One evening, as Jasmine was preparing dinner for the elderly man, she overheard the Mafia Boss talking to one of his associates in the hallway. His voice, usually commanding, was now softer, almost contemplative. "She's been a better caretaker than I ever imagined," he said. "I never realized how much she meant to my father." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected him to speak about her like that. To him, she had always been just a maid, someone to do the tasks no one else wanted to. But now, there was a change in the way he spoke about her, a recognition of her humanity. The next day, as Jasmine was helping the elderly man with his lunch, the Mafia Boss appeared in the doorway, his usual aura of authority surrounding him. But today, there was something different in his eyes. He wasn't just the intimidating figure that commanded respect. Today, he was someone who seemed almost vulnerable. "Jasmine," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about everything you've done for him. I don't know if I can ever repay you for your kindness." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected this. Never imagined that the powerful Mafia Boss, who controlled everything with a single word, would acknowledge her efforts in such a personal way. "You don't need to repay me," she replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. "I'm just doing my job." "It's more than that," he said quietly. "You've given him comfort when no one else would. You've shown him kindness when the world around him only offered indifference. That's more than just a job, Jasmine." For the first time, Jasmine saw him not as the feared Mafia Boss, but as a son who was struggling to hold on to what little time he had left with his father. She saw the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders, the burden of a life built on power and fear, and for the first time, she felt a deep sense of empathy for him. "I'm just trying to help," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I know," he replied, "and I appreciate it more than you know." There was a pause, a long silence that hung between them. Jasmine wasn't sure what to say next, but before she could speak, the Mafia Boss continued. "Jasmine, there's something I need to tell you. I've been keeping something from you, and I think it's time you knew the truth." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. The way he said it, the way his tone had shifted, made her feel like something big was coming. Something that would change everything. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's about my father," he began, his eyes darkening as he spoke. "He's not just any elderly man. He's been part of a much bigger story, one that's been hidden for years. And now, I need you to understand why you've been so important to him, and to me." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had never asked about the man's past, never inquired about his life before the mansion. But now, she realized that everything she had done for him, every moment she had spent with him, was tied to something much bigger than she had ever imagined. "I don't understand," she said softly. "What do you mean?" The Mafia Boss sighed, running a hand through his hair, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "My father has been keeping a secret, one that could change everything for us." He paused, his gaze intense. "And now, I need you to know the truth." Jasmine's mind raced as she tried to process his words. She had no idea what secret he was talking about, but she could feel the weight of it, pressing down on her. This wasn't just about taking care of an elderly man. This was about something far bigger, something that could alter the course of her life, and his. "What is the secret?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Mafia boss met her gaze, his expression grim. "You're about to find out," he said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken tension. "And when you do, nothing will be the same again." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what was coming, but she could feel that the moment of revelation was drawing near. Whatever the secret was, it would change everything. And for the first time, she wondered if she was ready to face it. The next morning, Jasmine could not shake the feeling that something was coming. The Mafia boss had told her that everything was about to change, but she had no idea how. As she went about her duties, taking care of the elderly man and ensuring his comfort, her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation they had shared. The boss's words echoed in her mind. "When you do, nothing will be the same again." What could it possibly mean? What secret had his father been hiding? Jasmine tried to push the thoughts aside and focus on the task at hand, but the tension in the air was palpable. The mansion, usually a place of routine and silence, now felt like a pressure cooker, waiting to explode. Later that day, as she was preparing dinner for the elderly man, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up, expecting to see one of the other staff members, but instead, it was the Mafia boss. His presence seemed to fill the room, and for a moment, Jasmine couldn't breathe. He had that effect on people, a power that came from more than just his position. It was in the way he moved, the way he carried himself, as if he were always in control, always 2 steps ahead. But today, he seemed different. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by something else, something almost uncertain. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low, "I need to tell you the truth." Jasmine's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Mafia boss walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling garden. His back was turned to her, but she could still feel the weight of his gaze. For a moment, he was silent, as if gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "My father, he wasn't always who you think he was." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that there was more to the elderly man than met the eye, but she never imagined it was anything like this. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The boss turned to face her, his expression hard to read. He was once a powerful man, someone who made decisions that affected more than just his family. He had ties to people, to organizations, that no one could touch. But somewhere along the way, he lost his way. He became a shadow of himself, hiding from the world, trying to atone for things he had done. Jasmine stared at him, trying to process his words. This wasn't the story she had expected. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice shaking. The boss took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "It has everything to do with you," he said. "You've been taking care of him not just out of duty, but out of kindness. And that is something my father hasn't had in a long time." Jasmine felt a surge of emotion in her chest. She had always cared for the elderly man, but she never thought it would mean anything to anyone, let alone the Mafia boss. "I just wanted to make him feel like he mattered," she said quietly, "like he wasn't forgotten." The boss's eyes softened for a brief moment, and for the first time, Jasmine saw a flicker of something. Empathy, maybe even gratitude. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "That's why you're important," he said, his voice steady once again. "My father, he's been hiding something for years. And you, Jasmine, are the key to unlocking it." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest. What could she possibly have to do with whatever secret his father was hiding? "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The boss took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I want you to help me get the truth," he said. "My father's past is catching up with him. It's only a matter of time before the people he wronged come looking for him. And when they do, I need to know that you're on our side." Jasmine's mind raced. She had never signed up for anything like this. She was just a maid, a woman who had come to care for an elderly man. She never imagined she would be drawn into a world of power, secrets, and danger. "I don't know if I can help," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't even know what the truth is." The boss's gaze softened again, and for a brief moment, Jasmine saw a glimpse of vulnerability in him. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, Jasmine," he said, his voice quieter. "But I need you. My father trusts you. And that trust is the only thing that can save him now." Jasmine swallowed hard. She had always thought of herself as a nobody, someone who would never make a difference. But now, standing in front of the most powerful man she had ever met, she realized that her actions, her kindness, had put her in the middle of something far bigger than herself. She had a choice to make. The Mafia boss was asking her to take a leap of faith, to step into a world she knew nothing about. But the stakes were high, too high to ignore. With a deep breath, Jasmine made her decision. "I'll help you," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect him." The boss nodded, his eyes gleaming with something close to approval. "I knew I could count on you," he said, his voice filled with resolve. And just like that, Jasmine knew her life would never be the same again. The following days were a blur of tense moments and unspoken understanding. Jasmine had agreed to help the Mafia boss, but she still didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had just stepped into. The elderly man's health continued to deteriorate, and with every passing day, Jasmine felt the pressure building. She wasn't just caring for him anymore. She was now part of something much bigger, a dangerous world of secrets, power, and unknown threats. The Mafia boss had made it clear that they needed to uncover the truth, whatever it was, before it was too late. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that the moment of revelation was drawing near, and with it, everything would change. It was late one evening when Jasmine was in the old man's room, trying to comfort him as best she could, that the Mafia boss entered the room. His usual cold demeanor was replaced by something else, urgency, almost as if he was carrying a heavy burden. "Jasmine," he said, his voice low but steady. "We don't have much time." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment was coming, but she wasn't prepared for it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The boss stepped closer, his eyes focused on his father, who was resting in bed. The old man's breathing was shallow, and his condition seemed to worsen by the hour. "My father's past is catching up with him," the boss continued, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "He did things, terrible things, that can't stay buried any longer." Jasmine swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had always known that the elderly man had a past, but hearing it from his son, the feared Mafia boss, made it feel real. "What are you asking me to do?" she asked, trying to steady her nerves. "I need you to help me," he said, locking eyes with her. "There's a man who's been looking for my father, a man who knows everything, and he's been waiting for the right moment to strike. I need to find out what he knows and make sure it doesn't destroy everything." Jasmine felt her stomach churn. She had never wanted any part of this world, but now she was caught in the middle of it. "How can I help?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boss looked at her, his gaze softening for a moment. "You know my father better than anyone else here. You've been the one by his side when no one else cared. I need you to talk to him, to get him to tell us everything." Jasmine's mind raced. She had spent so much time caring for the elderly man, but she had never asked him about his past. She had never wanted to know. But now, it seemed like the only way forward. "What if he won't talk?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. The boss's expression hardened. "He has to. His time is running out, and if we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Jasmine nodded, a sense of resolve settling in her chest. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. Later that night, after the elderly man had been tucked into bed, Jasmine sat with him in his room. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, and the silence in the room was almost suffocating. She knew this was her chance, the moment when everything could change. She sat beside his bed, taking his frail hand in hers. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man's eyes flickered open, his gaze cloudy with age, but he seemed to recognize her presence. "What is it, my dear?" he asked, his voice weak but gentle. "Tell me about your past," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happened before you came here?" The elderly man's face softened, and for a moment, Jasmine thought he might fall asleep. But then, he took a deep breath and looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of secrets. "You've always been kind to me," he said slowly, his voice trembling. "I never thought anyone would care enough to ask." He paused, his breath labored. "I've done things I regret. Things I would never want anyone to know." Jasmine leaned forward, her hand still holding his. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said softly, "but I need to understand. The Mafia boss, your son, He's afraid of what might happen if the truth comes out. I need to know what we're dealing with." The old man closed his eyes for a long moment, as if gathering his strength. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I was part of a life I never wanted," he said. "I got involved with people I shouldn't have. The things I did, the people I betrayed, it all caught up with me in the end. Your boss, my son, he was just a boy when all of this started, and I promised myself I would protect him from it. But the past doesn't stay buried forever." Jasmine listened, her heart heavy with the burden of his words. She had known the elderly man had a dark past, but hearing it from him, the man who had been nothing but kind to her, made it all the more real. "Is there someone coming for him?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old man nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking. "Someone who wants revenge. Someone who will stop at nothing to see my son destroyed." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She had never imagined that the old man's past would come to this, that it would threaten everything she had worked for. She knew she had to help, but she had no idea how. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The elderly man's grip tightened on her hand, his eyes searching hers. "You need to protect him," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "He's the only family I have left. Don't let him fall into the same trap I did." Jasmine nodded, a sense of determination rising within her. She didn't know how, but she would protect him, no matter what it took. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Jasmine had made her decision. She would help the Mafia boss and protect him at all costs. The elderly man's words lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of the danger that was closing in. She had always known that the mansion, with its grandeur and wealth, held secrets, but she never imagined that these secrets would threaten the very life she had come to know. As she moved through her daily duties, taking care of the old man and managing the household, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. The Mafia boss had warned her that his father's past would catch up with them, but Jasmine had no idea how soon it would happen. One evening, after finishing her tasks, Jasmine was walking down the long hallway when she saw him. The Mafia boss. He was standing in the doorway of the old man's room, his back turned, staring out into the distance. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. Jasmine didn't know what to say, but she knew this moment was crucial. This was the moment that would define everything. "Jasmine," the boss said, his voice low, almost weary. "I'm afraid it's too late." His words sent a cold shiver down her spine. She walked toward him, her heart racing. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The boss turned to face her, his eyes dark with concern. "I've received word," he said, his jaw tightening. "The man I've been running from is already here. He's not waiting anymore." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had always known there was a threat. But now, hearing the fear in the Mafia boss's voice, it felt all too real. "Who is he?" Jasmine asked, her mind racing. "Someone who knows too much," the boss replied. "Someone who has been hunting my father for years. And now he's after me." Jasmine's mind spun as the gravity of the situation hit her. The Mafia boss was not just facing his father's past, but the consequences of his own life. A life built on violence, betrayal, and power. A life that had now caught up with him. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The boss's eyes softened for a brief moment, and for the first time, Jasmine saw a hint of vulnerability. "We fight," he said, his voice firm once again. "We protect my father, and we protect each other. No matter the cost." Jasmine nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had already chosen her side. There was no turning back now. That night, as the mansion grew quiet, Jasmine stayed by the elderly man's side, her thoughts racing. The Mafia boss had given her a purpose, but she wasn't sure how much longer they could hold on. The world they lived in was dangerous, unpredictable, and as much as she wanted to believe in the Mafia boss's resolve, she knew that the fight ahead of them would be unlike anything she had ever known. Hours passed, and the silence in the mansion was broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps. Jasmine stood by the old man's bed, watching over him, as the moonlight poured in through the windows. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She froze, her heart racing. "Jasmine," a voice called out from the hallway. It was the Mafia boss. She hurried to the door, her mind racing. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. "It's time," he said, his face grim. "We need to move now. He's here." Jasmine's stomach dropped. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it hit her all at once. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The boss's expression was unreadable, his features hard as stone. "We fight," he said again, his voice cold. "We take control of this situation before it's too late." Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had been preparing for this, but she wasn't sure if she was ready. The world of the Mafia Boss was brutal, unforgiving, but she had already committed to protecting him, and now, there was no turning back. Together, they made their way through the dark halls of the mansion, moving quickly but quietly. The old man's condition had worsened, and Jasmine knew they didn't have much time to act. The Mafia Boss led the way, his steps confident but cautious. Jasmine followed, her heart pounding in her chest. As they reached the main hallway, they were met by a group of armed men. The Mafia Boss didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Get ready," he said, his voice firm. "This is it." The air was thick with tension as the confrontation unfolded. Jasmine stood behind him, her eyes scanning the room, waiting for any sign of movement. She could feel the danger closing in, but she also felt a surge of determination. She had chosen to stand by the Mafia Boss, and she wouldn't back down now. The room fell silent as the enemy finally appeared. He was tall, with a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to pierce through the Mafia Boss. The tension was unbearable as the two men locked eyes, each sizing the other up. "I knew you would come for me eventually," the Mafia Boss said, his voice calm, but there was a steely edge to it. The man smirked. "You can't outrun your past," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "And you can't hide forever." The Mafia Boss didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements swift and decisive. The battle had begun. Jasmine watched, her heart racing as the situation escalated. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment that would decide everything. And as the fight unfolded, Jasmine knew that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The tension in the air was suffocating as the Mafia Boss and the man from his past stood face to face. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the two men exchange glances, the weight of years of history between them hanging in the silence. The old man's fragile health weighed heavily on her mind, but she couldn't let it distract her. Everything was riding on this moment. The Mafia Boss stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man. Standing in front of him. "I've been waiting for this day," the boss said, his voice cold and calculated. "You've been a ghost, watching from the shadows. But now here we are." The man smirked, a look of arrogance crossing his face. "You've always been a stubborn one, haven't you?" he replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "Always running, always hiding. But now it's too late." Jasmine's mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. She had known there was danger, but seeing it unfold before her eyes made it all too real. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The Mafia Boss had told her this would be a fight for survival, but she had no idea how high the stakes truly were. She had seen power, manipulation, and fear in the boss's world, but now she was witnessing a different side of him. This was personal. He wasn't just defending his family, he was defending himself. The room was thick with tension as the enemy slowly reached for his gun. The Mafia Boss's hand shot out in the blink of an eye, knocking the weapon aside and pinning the man against the wall with terrifying strength. "I'm done hiding," the Mafia Boss said, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can come into my world and take what's mine? Not without a fight." Jasmine held her breath as she watched the struggle. It was like watching two predators locked in an intense battle for dominance, each trying to outmaneuver the other. The Mafia Boss was relentless, his every move calculated and precise, but the man fought back just as fiercely, using every trick he knew. The room erupted into chaos. The sound of gunfire echoed in the hallway, followed by the thundering footsteps of bodyguards rushing in to defend their boss. Jasmine stood frozen, her mind struggling to keep up with the rapid events unfolding around her. She knew she needed to act, but her instincts told her to stay back, to remain hidden from the violence that was now spilling into every corner of the mansion. She watched as the Mafia Boss pushed the enemy down to the ground, his chest heaving with exertion. His face was a mask of fury, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like relief. The man on the floor groaned, his hand reaching for a hidden weapon. But before he could make another move, the boss was on him again, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him to the ground. "You're not leaving here alive," the Mafia boss spat, his voice dripping with venom. Jasmine felt a surge of fear run through her as she realized how close they were to the breaking point. If the situation escalated any further, there would be no turning back. The man on the ground struggled, but it was clear he was no match for the boss. In the end, it was over as quickly as it had begun. The enemy was subdued, his threats silenced by the force of the boss's will. The room grew still, the only sound the ragged breathing of the men involved in the fight. Jasmine stood in shock, trying to process what had just happened. The Mafia boss, standing tall over the defeated man, turned slowly to face her. For a moment, their eyes locked. There was no triumph in his gaze, no satisfaction in his posture. Instead, there was something different, a weight, a burden. "I told you this would come for me," the boss said, his voice calm but tinged with something darker. "And now it's done." Jasmine didn't know what to say. The fight had been brutal, and while the threat had been neutralized, she couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on everyone involved. The old man, the man they had been trying to protect, was still in the background, his life hanging by a thread. She could feel the weight of everything bearing down on her. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Mafia boss nodded slowly, but his expression remained unreadable. "For now," he said, his eyes flickering toward the door where the bodyguards had gathered. "But it's never really over." Jasmine's heart sank. She had known this world was dangerous, but now she understood the true cost of it. There was no escape, no safe place. Every decision had consequences, and the lives of everyone involved were now intertwined in ways she never expected. She had become part of something much bigger than she could have imagined. The Mafia boss turned and walked toward the door, his bodyguards following closely behind him. Jasmine stood in place, still processing the whirlwind of events she had just witnessed. The room felt colder now, the silence more oppressive. She knew that what had just happened would change everything. She had helped the Mafia boss, but now she had to ask herself, was she ready for what would come next? As the boss disappeared down the hallway, Jasmine turned back to the elderly man's room, her mind racing with questions. What was the next step? What had they truly uncovered? And most of all, what would become of them all now that the past had come crashing into the present? The night after the confrontation felt eerily quiet. Jasmine sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of everything that had transpired pressing heavily on her. She had just witnessed a violent showdown, one that had shaken her to her core. The Mafia boss had taken control, as he always did, but the toll it had taken on her was undeniable. As she sat in the silence, her mind raced. What had she just become a part of? She had already crossed lines she never thought she would, but now, she wasn't sure where she stood. The old man's breathing was shallow, the sounds of his struggle a constant reminder that time was running out for him. Jasmine had taken care of him for so long, but now, with the boss's warning still fresh in her mind, it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. She could hear the footsteps approaching before the door creaked open. The Mafia boss walked in, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. There was no sign of the rage that had consumed him earlier, only the cold, calculated expression he always wore. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the quiet space before landing on her. Jasmine met his gaze, but there was a flicker of something there, something she couldn't quite place. "It's done," the boss said quietly, his voice low. "The man who came for us is dealt with." Jasmine nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had heard the sounds of gunfire earlier, but now, with the silence settling over them, it felt as if nothing had happened at all. "And what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boss walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened streets below. He didn't answer immediately, but when he finally spoke, his tone was different. "Now we wait," he said. "We wait for the aftermath, and we prepare for what comes next." Jasmine didn't fully understand what he meant by that, but she could sense the tension in his words. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fight they had just been through was only the beginning of something bigger. "What's next?" she asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. The boss turned toward her, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing her words. "I need to know I can trust you," he said, his voice steady. "There are still people out there who want to destroy everything we've built. And if you're going to be a part of this, you need to understand what that means." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She had already made her choice. She had already committed to helping him, but the weight of those words hit her hard. She wasn't just protecting an elderly man anymore. She was in the middle of a battle for survival, a battle against enemies who would stop at nothing to tear them apart. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The Mafia boss looked at her, his gaze piercing. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition, maybe, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. "I need you to stay by my side," he said. "And when the time comes, I need you to be ready." Jasmine nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had never been in this kind of world, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't back down now. The boss turned toward the door, signaling that the conversation was over. "I'll be in my office," he said. "When you're ready, come find me." Jasmine watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. She stayed in the room for a few moments longer, her thoughts swirling in a storm of uncertainty. The world she had stepped into was dangerous, unpredictable, and filled with more danger than she had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. She stood up, taking a deep breath. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She was in this fight for good. The only question now was whether she could handle what was to come. She walked slowly toward the door, her mind still racing, and as she stepped into the hallway, she realized that this was just the beginning of a long and dangerous road ahead. The Mafia boss had placed his trust in her, and now it was time for her to prove that she was worthy of it. She didn't know how long she could survive in this world of lies and violence, but she was determined to see it through. And as she made her way down the hallway toward the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The following days after the confrontation felt like they were suspended in time. Jasmine had joined the Mafia boss in a world she never thought she would enter, and now, she was more entrenched in it than ever before. The old man's condition continued to worsen, and every moment felt like it could be his last. As the boss had said, they were waiting for the aftermath. The tension in the mansion was palpable, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jasmine stayed close to the elderly man, keeping watch over him day and night, while trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The battle wasn't just a physical one. It was a war of secrets, of buried pasts, and of trust. Jasmine hadn't known what to expect when she had agreed to help the boss, but she had expected it to be different than this. The old man had spoken of a man seeking revenge, someone whose past was coming back to haunt them, but Jasmine hadn't expected the consequences to come so quickly. Her thoughts were interrupted when the boss entered the room, his usual confident stride replaced with a noticeable tension. There was something in his eyes, something that told her this moment was critical. "Jasmine," he said, his voice softer than usual, but there was a weight to it. "We don't have much time." She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. The air between them seemed to crackle with urgency. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. The boss's face hardened, the familiar coldness returning. "The people we've been running from are closing in. I've been trying to prepare for this moment, but there's only so much I can do." Jasmine felt the knot in her stomach tighten. "What's going to happen?" she asked, dreading the answer. "We need to leave," the boss said, his gaze shifting to the window. "They'll come for us soon, and when they do, we need to be ready." Jasmine's mind raced. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment everything would change. She had known the danger was real, but now, the reality of it was hitting her. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The fight had come to them, and they were going to have to face it head on. "I'll get the old man," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "No," the boss said sharply, his eyes meeting hers with intensity. "Leave him. We don't have time." Jasmine froze. She had been caring for the elderly man for so long, had spent countless hours by his side, making sure he was comfortable, safe. But now, the boss was telling her to leave him behind. "We have no choice," the boss continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll be putting all of us at risk if we stay any longer. He's too far gone. It's better if we leave him behind." Jasmine could feel her heart breaking as the words left his mouth. She had always believed that she had a responsibility to protect him, but now, the weight of the decision was too much to bear. "But he's still my responsibility," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't just leave him. It's not your choice." The boss snapped, his voice harsh. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." Jasmine stood there, conflicted, torn between the man who had become like family to her and the cold, calculated reality of the world she had been drawn into. "You're asking me to choose between him and you," she said quietly, the tears threatening to fall. The boss's expression softened, just for a moment, but his voice remained firm. "I'm not asking you to choose. I'm telling you that we can't stay." The silence between them was heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Jasmine looked at the old man, lying so still, so fragile, and she knew, deep down, that he wouldn't make it much longer. His time was running out, and so was theirs. "I'll do what I have to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't leave him like this." The boss nodded, understanding the depth of her words. "I'll help you," he said, his voice softer now. "But we can't waste any more time." The tension in the room was suffocating as they made their decision. Jasmine knew what she had to do, but the guilt of leaving the old man behind was something she would carry with her forever. As they moved quickly through the mansion, preparing to leave, Jasmine felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The sounds of footsteps echoed down the hall, the heavy silence reminding her that everything was about to change. The boss led the way, his presence commanding, but even he seemed to feel the pressure of what was to come. "We'll get through this," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Jasmine didn't respond. She couldn't find the words. Her mind was consumed with the image of the old man, lying in that room, his life slipping away. This was the price of the life they had chosen. And as they walked away, Jasmine knew that they were leaving behind not just a person, but a part of herself. They reached the exit of the mansion, the night air cold and unforgiving. The boss motioned for her to follow, but she paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on the mansion she had called home. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The night was thick with uncertainty as they made their way through the darkened streets, the weight of their decision hanging heavily over them. Jasmine's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more tangled than the last. She had left behind the elderly man, the person she had spent so much time caring for, someone who had become like family to her. She could still see his frail form lying in that room, his time slipping away. But there was no turning back now. The boss led the way, his stride purposeful and determined, but there was something different in his demeanor. His usual air of confidence was tempered by a quiet intensity. He was focused, but Jasmine could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. "We need to get to the safe house," the boss said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't sure what awaited them there. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something far bigger, something that could change everything. The safe house, a secluded mansion on the outskirts of the city, was supposed to be their refuge, a place where they could regroup and plan their next move. But Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that danger was never far behind. As they arrived at the gates, the guards immediately opened them, allowing them entry without question. The mansion loomed in front of them, its grandeur hidden by the night, but Jasmine couldn't find any comfort in its walls. The world outside was just as dangerous as the world within, and she knew that the storm was far from over. The boss led her inside, his footsteps echoing in the grand foyer. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and Jasmine could hear the faint hum of activity from the staff who were always present, even in times of crisis. "Get some rest," the boss said as he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We'll need you sharp tomorrow. The real work begins now." Jasmine nodded, though her mind was still racing. She couldn't rest, not with everything that had happened, not with the uncertainty of what was to come. She walked down the hallway, her heart heavy with each step. Her room, a simple but comfortable space, awaited her, but it felt like a distant place, a space she no longer felt connected to. She could still hear the sound of the boss's voice in her head, the urgency in his words, but she couldn't bring herself to let go of the fear gnawing at her insides. The weight of their situation was too much to bear. She could hear the muffled sounds of conversations down the hall as the boss met with his associates. They were planning their next move, discussing strategies and contingencies. Jasmine knew that it was all part of the game, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. She had crossed a line when she agreed to help the boss, but now she was in deeper than she ever imagined. The truth was, she didn't know what to expect anymore. She had been a maid, an outsider in a world of power and danger, but now she was in the thick of it. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was part of the game. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she tried to calm herself. She had never imagined her life would turn out like this. She had never imagined she would be standing in the middle of a world of crime and deceit, surrounded by people whose lives were defined by their power, their secrets, and their willingness to destroy anyone who stood in their way. Jasmine stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, but they didn't offer her any comfort. They were just a reminder of the world outside, a world that seemed so far removed from the one she had come to know. She thought about the elderly man again, his frail form, his quiet presence. She had been the one to take care of him, the one to listen to his stories, to comfort him in his final days. But now, she felt lost. The choices she had made were weighing on her, and she didn't know how much longer she could bear it. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts, and she turned to see the boss standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her heart race. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Jasmine didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if she was okay. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The boss studied her for a moment, his gaze never leaving her face. "I know this isn't easy," he said, "but we're in this together. We'll figure it out." Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. They had already lost so much. The old man, the life they had known, the safety they had taken for granted. Everything had changed in the blink of an eye. The boss stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. "Get some rest," he said again. "Tomorrow, we'll start making our move." Jasmine nodded once more, but as the boss turned to leave, she felt a sense of dread settle over her. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: they weren't safe yet. And as the door closed behind him, she was left alone with her thoughts, the silence of the mansion weighing heavily on her. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running, but she knew they would have to face whatever was coming head-on. The real battle had just begun. The morning arrived with a strange stillness, the kind of silence that only follows a storm. Jasmine hadn't slept much the night before, her thoughts tangled in a web of uncertainty. The boss's words echoed in her mind, reminding her that this was only the beginning. But she couldn't shake the fear that crept into her chest every time she thought of what was at stake. They had lost so much already. The elderly man, the life they had built, and now they were facing an even greater threat. Jasmine's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the coffee cup from the table, the warm liquid offering her only the smallest comfort. The mansion, for all its grandeur, now felt like a gilded cage. The weight of the decisions that lay ahead pressed down on her. She had made her choice, to stay and fight alongside the Mafia boss. But there were moments when doubt crept in. Would she be able to handle it? Could she survive in a world that demanded so much? The knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, pulling her back to the reality of what was happening. The boss's voice echoed from the other side, low and steady. "Jasmine, we need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. The time for quiet reflection was over. She set the cup down and opened the door to find the boss standing in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, his usual air of control intact, but there was something different in his eyes, something that spoke of the weight he carried. "Come with me," he said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. Jasmine followed him down the long, silent hallway, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The mansion seemed even colder today, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. As they reached the study, the boss opened the door and motioned for her to enter. The room was dimly lit, a large desk at the center, and bookshelves lining the walls. But Jasmine's gaze was drawn to the map on the wall, the red markers placed at strategic points across the city. "What's this?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the rising tension inside her. The boss walked over to the map, his finger tracing the lines, stopping at a point in the center. "This is where they're positioned," he said, his voice low. "The people who want to tear everything down. We've been tracking them for months, and they're closing in." Jasmine stepped closer, her heart racing as she looked at the map. Each marker represented a different threat, a different piece of the puzzle they were trying to solve. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boss turned toward her, his expression hardening. "Now we fight," he said. "We make sure they know we're not backing down. We send a message that we're not afraid." Jasmine's stomach churned. She had never imagined that her life would lead her to this moment, facing down enemies she could hardly understand, caught in a war that wasn't hers to begin with. But here she was, standing in the middle of it, with no way out. The boss's words filled the room, his voice steady as he continued. "I need you with me, Jasmine. You've seen what they're capable of. You've seen what happens when we show weakness. We can't afford that." Jasmine nodded, trying to push the fear aside. She had already chosen her side, but now, it felt like there was no turning back. The boss was right, they couldn't show weakness. But the reality of what that meant was beginning to sink in. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. This was their life now, and it would only get harder. The boss walked over to the desk, picking up a folder that had been placed there. He handed it to Jasmine, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. "Everything you need to know is in here," he said. "We move out tonight. Be ready." Jasmine took the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a list of names, addresses, and plans. It was everything they had gathered, everything they had been preparing for. But now it all seemed so real. "This is it," she said quietly, her heart racing as she looked at the documents in her hands. The boss nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "We do this together," he said. "And we end this. For good." Jasmine stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of his words. She had never asked for any of this, but now she was fully in it. The choice had been made, and there was no going back. The fight had come to their doorstep, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. As the boss turned and walked toward the door, Jasmine followed him, her mind spinning with the enormity of what was to come. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but one thing was certain, she was going to fight. And she was going to do it alongside the Mafia Boss, no matter what came next. The battle for survival had begun, and they were about to make their move. The night came faster than Jasmine expected, with every minute stretching into an eternity of anticipation. The weight of the upcoming operation, the fight that was about to unfold, seemed to seep into her very bones. The Mafia Boss had said they needed to move quickly, and she had no doubt that the danger was closer than ever. As she sat in her room, her mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. The man who had been hunting them, the shadow that loomed over their lives, was closing in. They had to strike first. They had to end this before it ended them. The house was buzzing with activity, but it felt more like a final gathering than anything else. The staff moved with purpose, knowing their roles and keeping their heads down. The Mafia Boss, ever the strategist, was directing every detail. Jasmine hadn't been told everything. She had only been given the basics, but she knew the stakes were high. They couldn't afford mistakes. She had agreed to help him, to fight alongside him, but as the hours wore on, she felt the fear building inside her. What if they failed? What if everything she had done so far was for nothing? The knock at her door snapped her out of her thoughts. She stood up quickly, her heart racing as the door opened. It was the boss. His face was hard, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. "It's time," he said simply. Jasmine felt a chill run through her. The reality of it was setting in. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was about taking control of their destiny. There would be no going back after tonight. "Are you ready?" the boss asked, his gaze unwavering. Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't sure if she could ever be truly ready for what was coming. "I'll do what I can," she said quietly. The boss studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening just a fraction. "I know you will," he said. "You've already proven that." Without another word, he turned and led her down the long hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet mansion. Every step seemed to take them closer to the unknown. As they reached the basement, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch around them. The underground level of the mansion was a stark contrast to the luxurious living spaces above. It was functional, practical, a place where business got done. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air as they walked past rows of weapons and equipment. This was where the real fight would happen. The boss led her into a small room at the far end of the basement. A large table stood in the center, covered with maps, documents, and photos. Several of the boss's closest associates were gathered around, their faces serious. They looked up as the boss entered, their eyes immediately turning to Jasmine. There was no judgment, only silent acknowledgement. The boss motioned for her to sit. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "We move out tonight. No more waiting, no more hiding. We end this now." Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This was it. The plan was simple, but the risks were high. The enemy was close, and they had to act fast. "We'll hit them at their weakest point," the boss continued, pointing to a spot on the map. "They've been gathering intel, and they think they have the upper hand. But we'll show them otherwise." Jasmine nodded, absorbing every word. The plan was risky, but it was their only option. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. "You know what to do," the boss said, turning his attention to her. "We need you to get close. Get the information we need. We can't take any chances." Jasmine felt the weight of the responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had never been in a position like this before, but she had already committed. There was no turning back now. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. The boss gave her a sharp nod. "Good," he said. "We leave in 10 minutes. Be ready." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Jasmine had never been part of something like this, and the gravity of it all made her head spin. She went through the motions, her mind focused, but there was a small part of her that couldn't shake the fear. She had never imagined she would be standing here, about to face down enemies she didn't know, with a life she had barely begun to understand. The boss's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you ready?" he asked again, his eyes searching hers. This time, she could see the weight in his gaze. This wasn't just business. This was personal. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than before. "I'm ready." The boss gave a small, approving nod before turning to his associates. The team gathered their gear, checked their weapons, and made final preparations. Jasmine followed their lead, though her hands felt clammy and her heart raced. She couldn't afford to let fear control her. She had made her choice, and now she had to see it through. The time had come. The mission was in motion. They were about to confront the threat head-on, and Jasmine knew that once they did, nothing would be the same again. The plan had been set into motion, and as they made their way to the safe house, Jasmine couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. The boss had been clear. There was no turning back now. This was their fight, their moment to either win or lose everything. Jasmine was ready, but even as the tension hung in the air, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her chest. The world they had entered was filled with danger, deception, and betrayal, and she was fully aware that every step they took could be their last. The team moved quickly, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the night as they arrived at the location. The safe house, once a symbol of refuge, now felt like a trap. The lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of tension. Jasmine stood at the entrance, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The Mafia Boss stepped forward, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he could sense every hidden danger lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. His expression was cold, unreadable. "We make our move now," he said, his voice steady but firm. Jasmine nodded, feeling the gravity of his words. She knew this was the moment they had been preparing for, but even now, she couldn't stop herself from wondering if they were walking straight into a trap. The stakes had never been higher. As they entered the building, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The safe house, with its carefully chosen location and reinforced security, had once been their shield, but now it felt more like a target. Jasmine's eyes darted around, taking in every detail, every shadow. They moved swiftly through the narrow hallways, their movements calculated. Every second felt like an eternity. The team was ready, but Jasmine knew it would only take one wrong move for everything to fall apart. The boss led them down into the basement, where the final steps of the plan would unfold. The room was cold, its walls lined with monitors and equipment. It was a war room, a place where decisions were made, and Jasmine could feel the weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She wasn't just a bystander in this world anymore. She was an active participant in the chaos that had become their lives. "We're here," the boss said, his eyes scanning the room as the team took their positions. Jasmine stepped forward, her heart pounding as she took a seat at the table. There were no more words, only the quiet hum of machinery and the occasional rustle of papers. The time for hesitation had passed. The final operation was upon them. The boss turned to her, his gaze sharp. "I need you to stay focused," he said. "This is the last chance we have. Everything depends on what we do next." Jasmine's mind was racing as she nodded. This was it. She was about to help the Mafia boss close the chapter on this dangerous chapter of their lives. But she had no illusions about the danger that still lay ahead. There was no guarantee of success, no promise that they would make it out alive. But in that moment, Jasmine realized something. They had already made the decision. There was no going back. The plan had been set, and now they would see it through to the end. As the team moved into position, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Jasmine sat in silence, her mind focused on the task at hand. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced. The sound of footsteps in the hallway echoed through the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The door opened, and one of the associates stepped in. "They're coming," he said, his voice tight. The tension in the room thickened, and Jasmine felt her breath catch in her throat. The moment of truth had arrived. The plan was no longer just a blueprint on paper. It was real. The enemy was closing in, and their next move would determine everything. "Get ready," the boss said, his voice low but filled with a quiet determination. Jasmine stood, her body moving on instinct as she followed the others to the prepared positions. She could hear the faint sounds of movement outside, the subtle rustling that signaled their enemy's approach. This was it. They were no longer fighting in the shadows. The enemy was here. Jasmine's pulse quickened as she prepared herself for what was to come. The air was thick with anticipation, each moment stretching out, and the silence that had settled over the room was broken only by the sound of their steady breaths. "We move on my mark," the boss said, his voice steady as ever. The seconds dragged on like hours, and then, with a single motion, he nodded. The room erupted into action. Jasmine moved swiftly, her training kicking in as she took her position. The time for hesitation had passed. The first few moments were a blur, a series of movements, quick decisions, and the sound of muffled footsteps as they made their way toward their objective. Jasmine's focus never wavered, her heart beating in time with her movements as she pushed forward, knowing that the success of their mission rested on this moment. They were close now. The final confrontation was moments away, and Jasmine knew that whatever happened next, they would either walk away victorious or lose everything. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. The moment of truth had arrived, and as Jasmine's eyes locked with the boss's, she realized there was no going back. The battle they had been preparing for had finally come to its conclusion. In this gripping and emotional tale, the complexities of love and power are intertwined, set against a backdrop of betrayal, survival, and personal growth. As Jasmine enters the high-stakes world of the Mafia boss, she finds herself pulled into a dangerous web of secrets, loyalty, and unexpected romance stories. Every choice she makes becomes a step deeper into a realm where the stakes are high, and survival is never guaranteed. Romance stories often explore the tension between love and circumstance, and Jasmine's journey is no exception as she navigates the difficult choice between loyalty to the elderly man who has become like family and the powerful Mafia boss who has unexpectedly brought her into his dangerous world. The tension grows as they prepare for a confrontation that could change everything. Romance stories frequently touch on themes of self-discovery, and Jasmine is forced to confront her own values as she faces life-threatening challenges. Will the love and trust she has built in this new world hold strong, or will it crumble under the weight of betrayal? The line between love and duty becomes blurred as Jasmine steps into a new role, one that forces her to make decisions she never imagined she would have to make. In the end, it is not just about surviving, but about understanding the complexities of relationships and the price of loyalty. Romance stories are not just about love, they are about the journey, and Jasmine's path is filled with choices that will test her strength and her heart. With every step, the story unfolds, showing how love can both heal and destroy, and how deep bonds can be formed in the unlikeliest of places. Through twists and turns, betrayal and redemption, the story captivates, proving that even in the most dangerous of situations, love can be the greatest power of all.